Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Body by Stephen King. Now, this was originally published in King's 1982 collection, Different Seasons, but in recent years has actually been reprinted as a standalone novel. This was also the basis for the 1986 Rob Reiner film Stand By Me. Now, I'll talk more about the film adaptation later on in this video. Now, I already reviewed The Body way back in 2014. That review is still up, however, it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out my old review of The Body. Now, I have Different Seasons right here, and this contains 4 novellas, including The Body. The other 3 stories in here are Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, which would later be adapted into the 1994 Frank Darabont film The Shawshank Redemption, as well as Apt Pupil, which would later be adapted into the 1998 Bryan Singer film of the same name. And actually, my copy of Different Seasons is the movie tie-in edition for the movie version of Apt Pupil. And then the final story contained in here is The Breathe-In Method, which so far is the only one of the 4 stories to not be adapted to film. Now, at the time, Different Seasons was considered to be sort of an atypical book for Stephen King, because with the exception of The Breathe-In Method, which is more prototypical King, the other 3 stories in here are almost completely non-supernatural and, for the most part, are grounded in reality. Different Seasons was also one of Stephen King's first books that was truly non-horror based. Even though I do consider Apt Pupil and The Breathe-In Method to be horror stories, they're a different kind of horror than Stephen King was known for at the time. And of course, Rita Hayworth and The Body are not horror stories at all. Now, you can tell Different Seasons was sort of Stephen King's attempt to be taken a little more seriously by mainstream literary critics. Not that horror can't be serious, and not that horror can't be literary, it certainly can, but at the time, Stephen King's brand of horror was considered, at least by certain literary critics, to be more pulpy, and at best his stuff was considered more popcorn fiction, which to an extent it is, but I also think Stephen King's books, even his horror stories, have a lot more substance than critics gave them credit for. I also think Stephen King never really gave himself the credit he deserved, because he has referred to his work as the literary equivalent of the Big Mac and fries, and I think that is kind of selling his work short, because first of all, he is a master at characterization. Even his more bombastic supernatural stories still have really good character drama in them, and still touch on some really powerful issues. But something I do love about Stephen King is there is a certain versatility to his work where he can be serious when he wants to be, but he also does embrace pulp, and he does embrace camp. I mean, just look at Creepshow, or honestly, a lot of the stories in Night Shift or Skeleton Crew. But once again, you could tell Different Seasons was sort of Stephen King's attempt to really show people that he can do a lot more than just horror, and even though I think the book was a success when it was first published, it still took a long time for people to really accept that. Now, this is not a review of Different Seasons as a whole. I'm reviewing The Body as a standalone work, but I think it's important to discuss the book that this story came out of. Now, looking at The Body as a standalone novella, this is actually one of my top 5 favorite books of all time, and this is my second favorite Stephen King book behind It. Now, while It is my favorite, a case could be made that The Body is technically the better story. And while The Body on the surface might seem like an atypical Stephen King story, if you're really paying attention to the themes that run all throughout Stephen King's work, in a lot of ways, this story is pure King. Now, I first read The Body in the summer of 2009. I had just turned 17, and it was the summer right before my senior year of high school, and I remember when I first read this affected me on such a deep and emotional level. Even though I was significantly older than the boys in the story, I still related to the story a great deal, especially some of the themes in the story that are touched on, like the relationship between Gordy and his father. Like, keep in mind, when I read this, I was kind of an angsty teenager, and I'm getting very personal, but I really had a lot of the same feelings towards my own father that Gordy had towards his father in the story, so again, the story really affected me in that regard. Admittedly, upon this reread, the story did not affect me quite as deeply as when I was a teenager, so I think when you read this is very, very important, but regardless, this is still an amazing story. And in a lot of ways, this might be Stephen King's most personal story. The story is definitely semi-autobiographical. There were several instances in Stephen King's life that I think definitely informed this story. Apparently, when King was 4 years old, he had actually witnessed a boy around his age hit by a train. Now, he has no conscious memory of this, but according to what his mother told him later on, she says, yeah, you were with him when this happened. I think there was another incident when King was a little older. Him and a friend of his apparently witnessed the police dragging up a drowning victim, and this apparently had a very profound effect on King. There's also an infamous and also darkly humorous moment in the book involving leeches. If you've read the book or if you've seen the movie Stand By Me, you know exactly what scene I'm talking about, and apparently that actually happened to Stephen King and his friends. But also, while this is a coming-of-age story about childhood, this is also very much a story about writing, because the narrator of the story, Gordy LaChance, we find out grows up to become an author, and you could tell he's definitely a cipher for Stephen King himself. Because the whole book is told from the point of view of an adult Gordy reflecting back on this incident that happened when him and his friends were children, and during these sections of the book, we get a lot of insights into Gordy's career as a writer. So again, while this is definitely a story about childhood and growing up, this is also kind of a metafictional commentary on the art of writing and on Stephen King's own career. Now, while this might be one of King's most personal stories, it should be noted that the story has had a plagiarism accusation leveled against it. King dedicates the story to a college friend of his named George MacLeod, and MacLeod is later claimed that the basic plot of the story was basically ripped off from a story that he wrote in college about a group of boys going to look for the body of a dead dog. And MacLeod later sued King over this, which obviously ended their friendship. I do think it's possible that King might have borrowed that basic idea from his friend, but having not read that story, I can't say whether or not, like, whole characters were ripped off from that story, but it does seem like he might have just borrowed that basic idea, but everything written around the plot is still Stephen King. But again, it's kind of hard to comment on, but it is something that even as a hardcore Stephen King fan does kind of give me some pause, and there's definitely a reason the book was dedicated to MacLeod. So the plot of The Body is it's set in the summer of 1960, and we follow four 12-year-old boys from the town of Castle Rock, Maine, which is a fictional town that several of King's other stories also take place in. But these boys are Gordy LaChance, Chris Chambers, Teddy Duchamp, and Vern, whose last name actually escapes me at the moment. But each of these boys come from very troubled households, especially Chris, and a few of them are from families that are sort of on the wrong side of the tracks, if you will. But in the story, we find out that a boy around their age from a few towns over named Ray Brower went missing, but one day Vern overhears his older brother talking with his friend about how they were out by the train tracks and they actually did find Ray Brower, but it turns out the kid is dead, likely be hit by a train. But the only reason Vern's older brother and his friend can't report it is because the only reason they were out there is because they had stolen a car. But when Vern hears this, he immediately goes to his friends, basically asking, hey, you guys want to see a dead body? And basically the whole story is these four friends setting out on this adventure to find the body of this missing boy, which when you describe the plot, it doesn't sound like much, but in a lot of ways, this is more a story about the themes rather than the plot. Because what starts off as this fun adventure for these friends really becomes this life lesson for all of them about mortality. And the main theme of the story really is death, and how death will eventually come for us all. But when you're 12 years old, you don't typically think about things like that, but these boys will now have to confront it head on when they come face to face with the lifeless body of a boy who is literally their age. And at first, it's kind of exploitive and kind of ghoulish what they're doing. I mean, they think it's going to be so cool to see this kid's body, not realizing that this kid had a life. This kid, had they known him, probably would have been friends with them. This kid probably has friends and family who really care about him. In so many ways, this kid could have been them, and that's what they'll have to confront when they do eventually see the body. The theme of death is also represented with the train. In a weird way, the train is almost a character unto itself. Before finding the body of Ray Brower, the boys have their own brush with death in probably the book's most suspenseful scene, when they're walking across a train trestle going over a river, and Chris and Teddy manage to make it to the other side, but Gordy and Vern are still in the middle of the train trestle when a train starts coming, and it's legitimately a pretty suspenseful and nail-biting scene. And again, that scene really hammers home that these boys could have been just like Ray Brower. And the book is a beautiful but also brutally honest depiction of childhood, especially childhood during this specific time period, that being the late 50s and early 60s in rural America. And the book is also about the struggles of growing up in lower income communities during this time period. And it is very much a book about small town life, both good and bad. Like, we see the beauty of this town, and we see the sheer ugliness of this town too. And in many ways, all four boys are the victims of the town's ugliness. Especially Chris Chambers. Chris is honestly probably the most compelling character in the novel. And Stephen King has said that in his opinion, Chris is the true protagonist of the story, and Gordy is really just the narrator or the observer. Like, Chris comes from a family that does not have a very good reputation, and unfortunately the rest of the town kind of judges him for it. Like, he's basically labeled a delinquent just because of who his family is, which is just horrible. And to be fair, his family does suck. It's clearly a very abusive environment that he comes from. But to basically judge this poor kid simply because of who his family is, like, I despise that whole, well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree mentality, and personally I think people who think that way should have their shit kicked in. And it's especially heartbreaking because while Chris can be a punk at times, he's also shown to be like a legitimately really good person. He's also shown to be a lot smarter than people give him credit for, and he has some shockingly adult insights into the world. Now, in the story we do learn that Chris has been accused of stealing the class's milk money, and there's a really heartbreaking moment in the story when he confesses to Gordy, yeah, I did it, but then I gave it back. And yet the money still disappeared, and all of a sudden the teacher I gave it back to had a brand new dress. And in some ways, it was Chris's first experience of an adult outside of his family letting him down. And there's definitely a theme of classism brought up in the book, because Chris does say to Gordy, you think she would have pulled that shit with one of the rich kids? Now, of the four boys, Gordy probably comes from the least abusive family, but there's still a lot of problems in his household. We learn that Gordy's older brother died a few months before the events of this story, and basically, after his older brother died, his parents have basically been ignoring Gordy. We learn that they have basically completely ignored him even before the brother died. Like, the brother was clearly the favorite of the two children, but while his parents are not out and out abusive towards him, they do kind of suck in their own way. But something that's important to remember is the whole story is being told from the point of view of an adult Gordy reflecting back on his childhood, and this could be just how he was perceiving it as a child, and maybe his parents didn't hate him as much as he thought they did. Now, I also gotta mention the character of Teddy Duchamp, because he is a very tragic character in his own right. Like Chris, he's also the victim of abuse, but in some ways he got it even worse than Chris, because he was the victim of a severe incident of domestic violence when his father held his ear up to a stove and nearly burnt the poor kid's ear off. Despite that, he still loves and idolizes his father, which is just so heartbreaking. He also clearly has a lot of anger issues and blows up at people over the smallest of things, but that also probably stems from the abuse he suffered. But we get a real sense that this poor kid never really had a chance, because he never really had a positive adult figure in his life. And then there's Vern, who is probably the least complex of the four main characters. Not that he's unlikable, but there's just not a lot to really analyze with this character compared to the others. Even though, I'll be honest, of the four main characters, I probably had a lot more in common with Vern when I was that age than any of the other main characters, because, I'll be honest, I was a dumb fucking kid growing up. I really was. But in a way, I also had a lot in common with Teddy, because I also had severe anger issues growing up. But a way I do think I relate to Chris is, while I was kind of a dumb kid, I was a little bit smarter than I was given credit for, because, I'm getting very personal now, but when I was in middle school, I think it was middle school, my mother was actually told I would never go to college. And guess what? I have 2 fucking college degrees now, so fuck you, bitch. By the way, I'm not calling my mother a bitch, I'm calling the person who told my mother that a bitch. So, I do see a lot of myself in the 4 main characters, even though my childhood was probably not nearly as turbulent as the childhood of the 4 main characters was. But my childhood was also not perfect. Like, in some ways, I had a very good childhood, especially compared to a lot of other people. But in other ways, my childhood was also kinda fucked up. But yeah, some of the themes of the story definitely do strike a nerve. Oh, by the way, just so there's no confusion and there's no misunderstandings, because I know I mentioned my dad earlier in this video, I want to make abundantly clear that when I say my childhood was kinda fucked up, my dad had nothing to do with that. It was something that happened when I was very, very young that my dad didn't even know about, and let's just say it's something that really shouldn't have been happening, and it really wasn't until my mid-20s where I started to kind of grasp the implications of what happened. Maybe one day I'll tell the story, but for now, it's really not the time and place to do that. Now, there is a villain in the story, that being Ace Merrill, who's the leader of a gang of bullies, which includes Chris's older brother and Vern's older brother. And Ace is definitely one of the great Stephen King villains, even though he's not exactly nuanced or complex. Like, he is the typical Stephen King bully where he's kind of just evil for the sake of being evil, but you know what? There are people like that in the real world. And there is a confrontation at the end between Ace's gang and Chris and Gordy's gang, and you get a real sense in that scene that if Ace knew he could get away with it, he probably would have fucking killed these kids. But Chris and Gordy do end up getting one over on Ace at the end, and you can tell it definitely takes a major blow to Ace's ego, but this ends up costing both Chris and Gordy dearly. Now, like I said before, there's a lot of aspects of this story that you can tell is as Stephen King being semi-autobiographical, with Gordy basically being the stand-in for King himself. Like, Gordy grows up to become an author, and the whole book is written as if it's Gordy's memoir, and there's a lot of moments in this where Gordy sort of commentates on the art of writing and on his own career, which you could tell is Stephen King commentating on his own career. And we actually get to read two of the stories that Gordy wrote, which were actually stories that Stephen King had written years earlier that he sort of spliced into the narrative of The Body. The first is a story called Stud City, which in the narrative of The Body is supposed to be a story that Gordy had written when he was in college, obviously years after the main events of The Body. But in real life, it was actually a story Stephen King had written in college. Now, when I first read The Body as a teenager, I actually really liked the Stud City section of the book. Upon this reread, I still actually like the story, but it's not the most well-written story in the world, and it's also very, very misogynistic. But after we read the story, it cuts back to Gordy's narration, and Gordy admits that, which you could tell it's Stephen King admitting that, and you could tell it's meant to be Stephen King commentating on his earlier writings and how far he's come as a writer. But in context of The Body, Stud City is supposed to be a story that Gordy wrote to sort of cope with the death of his older brother and his relationship with his father, because the protagonist of Stud City does have a very contentious relationship with his father and recently lost a brother. The other story is The Revenge of Lard Hogan, which again was an actual story that Stephen King had written years earlier that he sort of republishes in The Body as one of Gordy's stories. Now, in the narrative of The Body, The Revenge of Lard Hogan is a story that Gordy tells the other boys in a scene where they're camping out, but this is a hilarious story about a boy who is overweight and is constantly made fun of by the people in the town, so during a pie-eating contest, he decides to seek a hilarious but also absolutely disgusting revenge. It's a very funny story, and it really does feel like the kind of story that a 12-year-old boy would tell his friends. And I actually really liked that. I liked how there were two instances in this book where the main narrative stops and we basically get these little stories within the story. I've always been kind of a fan of that trope. There's also a moment when Gordy is talking about the art of writing, and he mentions how for him it's a very private, personal thing, almost like masturbation, which is totally a Stephen King thing to say, especially Stephen King around this time. But in that moment when Gordy compares writing to masturbation, he does mention how he has a friend who is also a writer who sometimes writes stories in the windows of bookshops, and I'm wondering if he's referring to Harlan Ellison in that scene, because I know Harlan Ellison actually used to do things like that. Now, while this is sort of an atypical story for Stephen King in that it's not a horror story and is for the most part non-supernatural and is supposed to be grounded in reality, there are still these little Kingisms that happen in the story that remind us of King's horror roots. For example, there's a moment when Gordy describes a dream that he had after Denny died, of Denny coming back as a zombie saying, "It should have been you, Gordy," which feels like a scene right out of a typical Stephen King horror story. There's also a moment when the boys are camping out in the woods and they hear these cries coming from the woods, which are likely just an animal, maybe a coyote or a loon or something, but it really does scare the shit out of the boys, and it's a genuinely pretty creepy scene. But King also does kind of insinuate in that scene that maybe the boys really are hearing the ghost of Ray Brower. It's nothing that's said flat out, but there is a very, very subtle supernatural implication to that scene. Another possible supernatural element to the story, but this is pure speculation on my part, but there's a moment when all four boys do a coin toss to see who will go get food, and at one point, all 4 coins land on tails. And then Vern's like, oh man, that's a goocher, which basically means bad luck or a bad omen. And while it's probably nothing, it's interesting to note that at the end of the book, we find out that, with the exception of Gordy, all 3 of the other boys ended up meeting very grim fates in the years following these events. And it almost makes you wonder, was what happened to the other 3 boys some cruel act of fate brought about by this goocher? Especially with what ends up happening to Chris. Now, this is a spoiler, but at the end of the book, we find out that in the years following the events of this story, Chris almost got away from the town. He ended up enrolling in college courses when everybody said he wouldn't be able to do it, and he ended up going to law school, and basically he almost made it, but ended up getting murdered. And again, it really feels like it was this cruel act of fate. But in some ways, it almost feels like it was the town of Castle Rock itself basically saying, you're not getting away that easily. But yeah, I cannot recommend The Body enough. It's one of my favorite Stephen King stories, and it's one of my favorite books of all time, even if upon this reread, the story didn't hit quite as hard as when I first read it as a teenager. Now, a lot of Stephen King's books take place in the same universe, and many of them interlock with each other. Now, The Body is a self-contained story. You do not have to read anything else by King in order to understand this. But this does include several connections and references to his larger body of work. Like I said before, this is set in the town of Castle Rock, Maine, which is a town that many of Stephen King's stories take place in, including Cujo, and there's actually a direct reference to Cujo at one point in this book. When Gordy is talking about the junkyard dog Chopper, he says that Chopper, at least until Joe Camper's dog Cujo went rabid 20 years later, was the most feared and least seen dog in Castle Rock. And I remember when I read that as a teenager, that just blew me the fuck away. I was like, what? You mean they're in the same universe? Like, I knew a lot of his stories took place in Castle Rock, but for some reason I was not expecting such an overt reference to one of his other stories. There's also a minor character from Cujo who shows up briefly at the end of The Body, and there are also references in The Body to a character named Constable Bannerman, who is heavily implied to be Sheriff George Bannerman, who played a major role in Cujo, but actually first appeared in the Dead Zone. Sheriff Bannerman was the cop who contacted Johnny Smith to help them catch the Castle Rock serial killer in the Dead Zone. He was the character that Tom Skerritt played in the movie version of the Dead Zone. Interestingly, the connection to Cujo also technically sets this in the same universe as Pet Sematary, because there is a direct reference to Cujo in that book as well, but there's another possible Pet Sematary connection, but this is purely 100% a fan theory. I already mentioned the scene where the boys are camping out and they hear these cries coming from the woods, which are likely a loon or some other kind of animal, but King does sort of insinuate that maybe they are hearing the ghost of Ray Brower in that scene. But a fan theory I came across is that where the boys are camping out is not that far from the Native American burial ground that was cursed by the Wendigo in Pet Sematary, and perhaps the boys are actually hearing the cries of the Wendigo. Now again, that's 100% a fan theory. I don't believe Stephen King has ever confirmed or denied the possible Pet Sematary connection in that scene, and I'm not sure if I completely agree with the theory, but it is fun to speculate on, especially if we do consider that all these books are taking place in the same universe. Ace Merrill, who is ostensibly the antagonist of The Body, would also show up in Stephen King's short story Nona, which was one of the stories from Skeleton Crew, and if memory serves right, I think Teddy is also briefly referenced in that story as well. But Ace would actually go on to be the secondary antagonist of Needful Things, and I believe Gordy and the other characters are referenced in that book as well, because apparently in Needful Things you find out that what happened at the end of The Body body did such damage to Ace's ego that it affected him all the way into adulthood. Stephen King wrote a novella called The Sundog, and the secondary antagonist of that book was this greedy shop owner named Pop Merrill, and Pop is actually Ace's uncle. Ace is even referenced several times in that story. There's also a reference in the body to the town of Jerusalem's Lot, which was the primary setting of Salem's Lot. Shawshank State Prison is also referenced at one point, which of course was the primary setting of Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption. And actually it's interesting, I think Shawshank is technically referenced in all four of the stories in different seasons, technically set in all four stories in the same universe. The town of Derry from It is also referenced in this story, and it was actually published a few years after The Body. Now, besides the reference to Derry, there's not a lot of overt connections between the two stories. I mean, they technically are in the same universe because the serial killer from the Dead Zone is briefly referenced in It, and I already mentioned the connections with George Bannerman and Cujo. But more importantly, I do think there are a lot of thematic connections between the two stories. Like, in a lot of ways, I do consider It to be sort of a spiritual successor to The Body. Now, yes, The Body is more reality-based and is for the most part non-supernatural, whereas It is more prototypical King with the horror and the sci-fi fantasy elements, but at its heart, It is very much a coming-of-age story about the struggles of growing up in small-town America in the late 50s and early 60s, very much like The Body. And at their core, both stories are about young kids having to confront death. Obviously, in The Body, death is represented by the train and the body of Ray Brower, whereas in It, death is represented by an interdimensional demon that takes on the form of a clown. But once again, thematically, the two stories are very similar. Now, there are also references in The Body to the town of Chamberlain, Maine, which was the setting of Stephen King's first novel, Carrie, and interestingly, at the end of Carrie, there is a gas station that is owned by somebody named Teddy Duchamp. Now, that being said, I actually don't think Carrie is in the same universe as this, because what Carrie White does at the end of that book becomes a major event that the entire world finds out about, and you gotta figure, if Carrie was in the same universe as The Body or the other Stephen King books that I mentioned, you would think the events of Carrie would have been referenced at some point in one of the other books. Also, based on what we find out happens to Teddy at the end of The Body, it would contradict the idea of him eventually owning a gas station during the events of Carrie, and also the timelines don't really match up at all. That being said, if we want to tie it in with Stephen King's Dark Tower series, which deals with the whole multiverse concept, perhaps Carrie is actually taking place in an alternate timeline, or another level of the tower, which is what alternate universes are referred to in the Dark Tower mythology. Admittedly, that is getting into pure fan theory speculation, and I'm not even sure if Stephen King himself really thought that deeply about it, and of course, once you mention Dark Tower, all bets are off, because essentially everything Stephen King wrote is supposed to tie in with the Dark Tower in some way, shape, or form, especially his books like The Stand and The Eyes of the Dragon and Hearts in Atlantis and Insomnia. So like I said before, this was later adapted into the movie Stand By Me, directed by Rob Reiner, who also directed films like This Is Spinal Tap, A Few Good Men, as well as another great Stephen King adaptation, that being Misery. Now, before he got into directing, Rob Reiner was actually an actor and was probably best known at this point for playing Archie Bunker's son-in-law in All in the Family. But Stand By Me is an amazing, amazing film. It's probably the greatest Stephen King adaptation, at least next to The Shawshank Redemption. Shawshank might technically be a better film, but I do think Stand By Me has more rewatchability to it. It's also one of the great American American films of the 1980s, and might be the finest coming-of-age movie. Now, they changed the title to Stand By Me based on the Benny King song of the same name, and the reason they did that was because knowing this was based on a Stephen King story, they didn't want people to think that this was a horror movie, and I can understand that, and also, I'm not gonna lie, Stand By Me is a much better title than The Body. Now, as an adaptation, it's remarkably faithful to the novel. It does change certain things, or it condenses, or streamlines some things, but it stays true to the tone and spirit and themes of the book. The only change that did kind of irk me, and it's only because I'm such a Stephen King nerd, is the fact that they changed the location of Castle Rock from Maine to Oregon. But literally that's just a nerdy nitpick, and people who haven't read the book or aren't that familiar with King's overarching continuity aren't really gonna give a shit, and it really has no bearing on the story itself. Now, one major change that the movie does make from the book is it does make Gordy more of the central protagonist, whereas the book was more of an ensemble piece and Gordy just happened to be the narrator. In fact, as far as Stephen King is concerned, Chris Chambers is the true hero of the story, but Rob Reiner decided to make Gordy really the principal character, and the film is really about Gordy's coming of age. There's actually a very significant moment at the end of the book when they finally find the body of Ray Brower, and then they're confronted by Ace Merrill's gang, and Chris Chambers takes his father's gun, which he stole for the trip, and points it at Ace, threatening him. In the movie, they make Gordy the character who threatens Ace with the gun. I think that was a smart change for the movie. The way I look at it is having Chris be the one with the gun at the end works for the book, whereas it wouldn't work in the movie, and vice versa. Having Gordy be the one who threatens Ace with the gun at the end works for the movie, whereas it wouldn't have worked in the book. Now, in the film, Gordy is played very well by Will Wheaton, who would go on to play Wesley in Star Trek The Next Generation. And Will Wheaton has mentioned in later interviews how much he related to Gordy, especially with his relationship with his own parents, because Will Wheaton's been very open about how his parents were very emotionally abusive towards him, and even though he was a kid at the time, you can tell he's definitely bringing some of that emotional baggage to the role. And then you had River Phoenix as Chris Chambers, and my god, he was a force to be reckoned with in this movie, and I really can't see anybody else playing this character besides River. And the fact that River Phoenix in real life ended up dying of a drug overdose, I think only like 7 years after they shot this movie, makes the final moment of the film when we find out what happens to Chris Chambers after the events of the movie all the more haunting in ways that I don't think the movie initially intended. And River Phoenix and Will Wheaton played so well off of each other, and their chemistry was definitely unique, especially when we see them both breaking down and then comforting each other. As much as Rob Reiner made Gordy the central character of the story, I would argue both Gordy and Chris are dual protagonists. You also have Corey Feldman as Teddy Duchamp, and Corey Feldman has opened up about how much he related to Teddy, and I know Corey Feldman was also the victim of abuse growing up, and I think he definitely brought a lot of that turmoil to the role, kind of like Will Wheaton. And this, along with The Goonies, as well as Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter, and then later on, The Lost Boys, really did cement Corey Feldman's status as a teen idol in the 80s. And then you had Jerry O'Connell as Vern. Now, this was Jerry O'Connell's first movie, and for his first performance, he does a really good job, honestly. And then you had Kiefer Sutherland as Ace Merrill, and the movie does add a lot more scenes with the bullies, and apparently Kiefer Sutherland got really into his role, and a lot of the child actors in the movie, like Jerry O'Connell, would say in later interviews, oh yeah, Kiefer fucking scared us. And he is such a prick in this movie, and he really does inhabit Ace Merrill. You also had John Cusack as Gordy's older brother Denny, who shows up in flashbacks, and the movie does romanticize the relationship between Gordy and Denny a little bit, whereas in the book, Gordy certainly loved Denny, but their relationship was a little more distant. But again, the way I look at it is, it works in the movie, whereas it wouldn't have worked that well in the book. And then you had Richard Dreyfuss, who I will probably always recognize best as Matt Hooper from Jaws, as the adult Gordy, who also narrates the film, and his narration in the movie is beautiful, and honestly, whenever I read the book, I read it in Richard Dreyfuss's voice. You also have character actor Marshall Bell, who people might recognize as Coach Snyder from Nightmare on Elm Street 2, as Gordy's father. You also had Frances Lee McCain, who people might recognize as Billy's mother from Gremlins, as Gordy's mother. But all the actors in the movie just inhabit their roles, and it really does feel like the characters from the book coming to life on screen. Now, in the movie, they do show the Lard-ass sequence when Gordy is telling his friends the story of Lard-ass Hogan, and from what I understand, Rob Reiner initially wanted to cut that, but you know what? It works. It really does work for the movie. Technically, it does interrupt the tone a little bit, but I also don't give a shit, because even though this is a drama, it also can work as a comedy as well. Stand By Me is a very funny movie. But yeah, Stand By Me is a beautiful film. It's funny, but also touching and genuinely moving, and really sad as well. The movie was a huge hit, and was actually nominated for an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay, and at the time, Stephen King said it was the best adaptation of any of his books. It also made the song Stand By Me, which is used in the film's end credits, and was a hit when it first came out back in 1961, a top 40 hit all over again, and around the time the movie came out, they also did a new music video for the song, and both Will Wheaton and River Phoenix essentially reprised their roles as Gordy and Chris in the music video. You can also see Stand By Me's influence on later coming-of-age movies like Now and Then, and even The Sandlot to a certain degree. You can also see Stand By Me's influence on Stranger Things, especially that first season, although Stranger Things is kind of a pastiche of several different influences, not just Stephen King, but also John Carpenter and Steven Spielberg. Stand By Me has also been parodied multiple times, like on The Simpsons and Family Guy. Now, after the movie, Rob Reiner would establish Castle Rock Entertainment, obviously named after the town from both Stand By Me and The Body, as well as other Stephen King stories. Now, it's not by Stephen King, but if you are a fan of The Body or Stand By Me, a book I would highly recommend is Boy's Life by Robert R. McCammon. Again, if you're a fan of this story, definitely check out Boy's Life. Now, Ace Merrill showed up in Season 2 of Castle Rock, where he was played by Paul Sparks. Castle Rock was a Hulu series produced by J.J. Abrams, which was not written by Stephen King, and it was not based on any one particular book by him. Rather, it was sort of an amalgamation of several of Stephen King's stories, and the show was an original story that was just set in the Stephen King multiverse. Now, it's not exactly in continuity with the books. The way I kind of look at the show is, I kind of look at it as being set in an alternate timeline. If you want to connect it to Dark Tower, you could say it's set on another level of the tower. Especially because the Ace Merrill who shows up in Season 2 of Castle Rock is clearly not the same Ace from the books. So again, the way I look at it is this is sort of an alternate universe version of the character that we know. The same with Pop Merrill, who shows up in Season 2 of Castle Rock, played by Tim Robbins. But yeah, that was my review on The Body by Stephen King, which was published in different seasons, and long days and pleasant nights to you.